for a few years now, a couple of years, in collaboration with the Economic Research Forum based in Cairo. So some of you who may not know about ERF, it's a think tank like ARC, mainly covering North Africa and Middle East. So it's one of highly reputed research and capacity building forums. So I'm very happy to see that our project has come through, and today we are almost disseminating the findings. When we started this project, there was no COVID, there was no Ukraine war, and we are hearing from our panelists about the role of disruptive technologies might seem, from the perspective where we are standing today, a little bit overreaching, but the technologies are evolving, emerging, and potentially transforming economies globally, regionally, and also nationally. So I'm very pleased to invite the Director of Research and Programs in ERF, Ms. Yasmin Fahim, to give us her opening remarks on behalf of ERF. And then we proceed to the next item of the agenda. The Executive Director of ARC will join us later in the day. So while we wait, let me give Yasmin the floor. So Yasmin, the floor is yours. Please go ahead and make your opening statements. And we all welcome to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Abebe. Can you hear me? Just checking.
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of ERF, I greet you all. We are very happy and excited about today's event. By way of background, we launched this project in March 2020, indeed before COVID times. This project received generous support from Carnegie Corporation. This interregional collaboration on implication of digitalization and disruptive technologies for sustainable growth, poverty, inequality, women and youth in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa involves 3 country case studies from the MENA region. Those are Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan, and 4 Sub-Saharan countries, South Africa, Senegal, Kenya, and Ethiopia. In addition to that, there are 2 broader thematic framework papers that were produced, one highlighting the role of digitalization in the structural transformation in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa, and another providing a comparative analysis of mobile internet uptake and use in both regions. Today, we are delighted to share with you the results of the 2 thematic papers, in addition to the 5 case studies of the 4 Sub-Saharan African countries. As for the MENA case studies, these are still under production. We just concluded data collection in the 3 countries, Morocco, Jordan, and Egypt. The surveys are extensive surveys providing information on e-firms. Such data and information was not available, so this brings a lot of value also to the project. The MENA studies will be disseminated in early 2023 in a similar event, and we hope you will also join us for that one. We are grateful for the generous contribution of the Carnegie Corporation, which made this project possible. And I would like also to thank the authors of the papers for their efforts and dedication throughout the project. Of course, we are very thankful to our partner and sister organization, the ARC, for this fruitful collaboration, their valuable support and insights in this project. It really was a pleasure working with the ARC team, as usual. And we are looking forward to continuing this partnership in the future through new fruitful projects and collaborations. Finally, I'd like to thank you all, whether you're attending in person or through online channels. I hope you will enjoy the presentations and look forward to engaging and stimulating discussions. Thank you. Over to you, Abebe.
This is a wonderful welcoming. As she mentioned, this has been just one of the collaborations we have with ERF. We work on multiple projects with them, and it has been growing and strengthening over the past few years. And we are very grateful for the support and at the same time for the partnership. So as we wait our keynote speakers from the Safaricom, which is we thought is most appropriate for us to give us insights. They are one of the companies, at least in Africa, who have made advances in new technologies with regard to payment systems. And they have first-hand experience, if at all, about the nature of technological disruptions in the sector, in the financial sector in which they specialize. So while we wait for them, probably we take a little health break. I mean, this is too soon to take a break, but scholars, that's what we are planning to do. And then we come straight forward in about 10 minutes, stretching the legs, whatever. And then we go straight into the presentations of the papers. So we apologize a bit for the disruptions in discussing disruptive technologies, but we'll manage. And I beg your indulgence, since you have also stakeholders here. Very happy to see that we will be navigating very well through the afternoon. We have coffee and tea available to all of you. So we'll get back to you in about
Hello.
Good morning, Jem.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just couldn't. Didn't seem to work.
Are you?
Sorry, I just wanted to check that you could hear me.
No, it works very well. So
okay.
Yeah, we want to check also. Are you ready?
Me?
Because we are having a short break.
Yeah,
So I was looking at if you are ready, we could just probably go ahead.
No, it's okay either way.
With your presentation, I think that makes a lot of sense.
It's up to you.
No. I'm very happy. Yes, it's up to me. So why don't we put up your presentation? Colleagues, you can help us with the PowerPoint for the first session. Is Professor Jem Demelo.
Okay. Maybe I should.
Friend, so I can abuse him. Yeah, you can start. Yeah.
Should I?
Wait a second. You can share your PowerPoint
share now,
with us.
Do you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, Jamie, we can. Yes.
Yeah, I'm seeing it on the screen. Yes, yes, we see it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, we see it. So go on. You're live now.
So if that's okay, and while we're waiting, if it's okay with you, I'll just start and quickly go through what I tried to do. And by the way, I'm very sorry that I have not been either available to come over and be with you, which is what I was hoping to do. But I was in another meeting for 2 days here in Florence, and I just finished last night after 2 long days of meetings, and then I had prepared the presentation, and I did a few changes last night. That's why I didn't send it to you earlier. So let me just say that I'm presenting today the paper that we did for ERF as part of this project, which was mostly with a somewhat more of a MENA focus, even though it was also concentrating on Sub-Saharan Africa. So part of the time there'll be maybe just a little bit more on MENA than on Sub-Saharan Africa, although I try to do the comparisons all the time. There is also another project which is very closely related, which Abebe has been directing, which is a collaborative research project on global value chains in Africa. And there we have just finished producing 8 papers, and I'm sure that 10 papers. I'm sure there will be a meeting on that project too. And in that other project, our contribution, which I will not speak about today, is about the implications of global value chains and just in general of structural transformation on CO2 emissions. And there the project is looking at the sources of growth in emissions and what to do to reduce emission intensities and globally emissions across African countries and in comparison with other regions. So this is the other project, which is also somewhat related to this one. So let me just go ahead and try in about 10 minutes to give you the gist of the paper, which is both available on the website, on the ERF website. There's also a link to a blog, which is a 2,000-word summary of that paper, and also the links to those papers at the end of this presentation. So if I go, is it working? Yes, I'm on the first page.
Yes, Jimmy.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just checking. Okay, so very quickly, the paper is very long. There are a lot of graphs. There are also a lot of tables, and I just want to go a quick appreciation, looking first at the challenges for MENA and the challenges for Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there's a huge diversity everywhere, but I'm just, for the sake of presentation, going to try and say, well, you know, this is maybe the challenge more appropriate for MENA, and this is the one more appropriate for Sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll just go through the overall appreciation for MENA, then the one for Sub-Saharan Africa, even though there's a lot of diversity, and I'll ask you to be kind enough to say, okay, well, he's simplifying, but that can be somewhat useful. So the data, and I'm not going to go through it in the details, but you will have access to it both in some of the slides in the presentation, but especially throughout the paper. For MENA, what we observe is that servicification has been extremely low, and I'll get to what is servicification, which is basically what are the share of services trade in the economy. As you know, the growth of services has been outpacing the growth of manufacturing for more than a decade. And part of that is what is distinguishing Africa and to some extent also MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa. They have been growing, their services have been growing faster than manufacturing, but not as fast as other comparable countries. Now, what are comparable countries? Well, to make it simple, we say, we just go by low income, middle income, and we compare African, Sub-Saharan African, and MENA countries with their comparators in terms of per capita income. So MENA has lagged. Okay, so there's a question of why have they lagged, and I'll try and give you a couple of possible explanations. And there are really two scenarios. You could say, well, so far there is, because the growth has been so slow, there's a strong potential, an opportunity to leverage digitalization. Now, digitalization was the topic we were assigned to write in this project. So what are the components of digitalization, and what are the outcomes? I'll have a slide on that in just a little bit later. So the idea is, well, if you can digitalize successfully, then you will be catching up, and of course you should be catching up because the rest of the world services is growing faster than manufacturing. So, why we should try and get on the bandwagon. Now, the good, or let's say the optimistic scenario is that we have a rather young computer savvy workforce that could be put to work, let's say, on digitalization. And relative to Sub-Saharan Africa, the hardware part of digitalization, that is the cables, the networks, the access to the digital infrastructure is higher in MENA than in Sub-Saharan Africa. So in some sense, the elements are there, the hardware is there, but then you could say, well, what about the software? The software there would be the policies that go with it on the one hand, and that's the government, but also the readiness of the workforce to participate in digitalization. Now, when I'm talking about digitalization, it's not just access and to do SMS and just communication, but also to use data processing, which is very important. And that is where MENA so far, and of course even more Sub-Saharan Africa, have been lagging. So if you're optimistic, you might say, well, digitalization, which is really going to mean the ultimate death of distance, meaning by that, death of distance properly measured for services trade data, where services trade data is an increasingly important part of trade, even though very often you cannot measure it because data doesn't cross borders and you don't see customs. So it's a challenge to measure it. But as you know, services being embodied in goods, then it will be a complement and very, very important. Now, MENA, by and large, I'm exaggerating, of course, but somehow you could say, well, MENA has missed the boat of manufacturing growth. But maybe now they can just get onto this new challenge, which is to digitize, digitize is to get into what was on paper into digital information, but also to digitalize, which is to get all the activities or more of the economic activities via ICT communications. Now, if they succeed, then they will have missed the boat maybe on manufacturing, but they could catch, and they should catch up on the digitalization process. Now, that means that the MENA would be catching up, and everything is there, at least the hardware is there. But then you have two issues. One is the readiness, and I'll compare here again, the readiness for the network readiness of MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa with other comparable countries. And their indicators of network readiness are low. And also, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, is the importance, or let's say the relative readiness of the public and of people to use digital. So I'll go through and so here, this is let's say the two possible scenarios. The bad, well, let's say the pessimistic scenario is that lack of readiness might slow this opportunity. Now if I go to Sub-Saharan Africa, here the challenge is a little bit different, because even though we have absolutely no information yet, because digitalization has just started, it is just starting actually in parts of the world, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, but to some extent also in MENA. So we haven't observed the outcomes. It's an ongoing process. So all we can do is guess, and maybe, of course, also take a look at what has happened in the last 10 years. So in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, digital readiness is also low. But in addition to that, the cost of capital is high, and perhaps the challenge is that if it turns out that the digitalization is going to mean a loss of jobs, or if there are jobs, the jobs that are created by digitalization are not as high as they would be in the standard manufacturing growth, as not even taking into account that there is, of course, some services are embodied in goods trade, then it could be a challenge for employment, because it could rob Sub-Saharan Africa from its demographic dividend offered by rising wages in China. So you have rising wages in China, of course, and this means also that it is an opportunity for Africa. Now, for both countries, there is this climate-related change, migratory pressures, and the fact that we don't have no planet B, so we really all countries will have to participate, much less, of course, in the low-income countries, to reduce the amount of the growth in emissions, eventually to get towards zero emission growth. So this is something which is another topic, but is also part of the challenge ahead. So here is perhaps if you look at this picture here, we have GVC participation. No, GVC participation can be decomposed into two aspects. One is the share of value added in growth exports. The share of value added, it can be the share of domestic value added and the share of foreign value added embodied in exports. Now, we have data for many countries over the 1990 to 2015 period. So that's really, 25 years of data, and the data is far from perfect, but it is the best we have. It's the UNCTAD EORA database, which several papers and reports have been using. And what you have here is the participation, two measures of participation with a 45-degree line showing what the participation rate is in 1990 and what it is in 2015. So you see that for all regions, it's somewhat above the 45-degree line. So that means that GVC participation has been growing. However, what is somewhat surprising, if you look at the geography of it, is that MENA should be where the star is. It should be much higher, given, in particular, that geographically, MENA is very close to Europe. So it's very close to its major market. So one of the comments you might say is, well, MENA has been defying geography. They should be doing better. They should have been higher already, okay, initially. Or if you wanted, you could go vertically, say, well, maybe it should have been at 35% in 1990, but then today it should be at 50, 55%, or very close to what it is in Europe and Central Asia, right? Because we're so close to it. And so that is that is somewhat the challenge. So it is pretty clear in the data that MENA should have been doing better. Look at Sub-Saharan Africa. The amount of participation isn't that low, let's say, compared to East Asia and the Pacific. It also has been growing, but less than East Asia and the Pacific. Okay, but MENA should really be doing better if you look at this data. So let's go just a little bit further and dig into this. So I will not go, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go through this in great detail. But one of the reasons, of course, is that trade costs have been high. Now, if trade costs are high, what are trade costs? Well, there are many elements into it, but the effect of high trade costs, if trade costs are high, then you're going to trade less. And that's what's related. The famous gravity model that economists use all the time show that high trade costs are associated, not to mention are the main cause of low trade. So what we see is relative to other regions, trade costs have been falling. I'm going to show you this in the next slide, but it has not been slowing down as rapidly as in other parts of the world, or at least in certain countries. So then the other part of the presentation, I'll be very quick on that, is to show that services trade has been low, especially in MENA, and that it has concentrated in transport and tourism. It has not been trade in services that involve data, which is all what servicification is all about. Now, in MENA, there has been a relatively high mobile usage, but that high mobile usage is really mostly for just SMS and other other parts of the digitalization has not occurred yet. So let's very quickly I define words. It's been done many times, but digitization is ongoing. So analog representations of data are being digitized, and digitalization, which is almost the same word but not quite the same, has been confusing me initially, so that's why I'm putting up the slide. It's applying digital technologies to existing business processes. Now, to get there, of course, you have to digitize, and maybe to digitize, you need to have the hardware, submarine cables, of course, and other access, but then also you need to know how to use it, right? And that is the process of digital transformation. And there's a hard and soft aspect to it, which I'll go in very quickly. And servicification is this increasing intensity of the share of services in GDP. As I said earlier, it's been higher. It's been growing faster than GDP everywhere in the world, although relative to other regions, it has not grown as fast as others. So here you have the number. Services percent of GDP in Arab states has gone up by 5 percentage points, which is not negligible, but it's been less than in other countries. In middle-income countries, of which most MENA countries belong, it's been half of what has been in other middle-income countries. I always say the other middle-income countries, there's of course the superstars in East Asia, but there are other countries as well, not notably Latin America and so on. So there's been a lag. It's very clear in the data, and the issue is why. So this, I'm going to skip this slide pretty much, but what you see is trade costs relative to the trade costs of the 20 partners in the world that have the lowest bilateral trade costs. What am I saying here? Well, what matters in trade, as you know, is really almost all the time is how are you doing relative to others, what we call comparative advantage. So, you know, if your trade costs are falling faster than others, then you're catching up. But if everyone's trade costs are falling and yours are not falling as fast, you're losing ground, right? So what you have here is some type of let's say, very summary, which are averages across the region, which show that in MENA and in Sub-Saharan Africa, the trade costs have been falling and they've been catching up a little bit. You see, they're lagging. Let's say MENA, they were lagging, they were 182% higher than the bilateral trade costs of the 20 countries with the lowest. So there you're 182% above. You go down to 144. You're doing a little bit better, but you're still lagging hugely. And that is a problem. And then the GCC group has been doing somewhat better. But even so, controlling for all these geographic factors, trade costs are very high. Now, what is that reflected in? Well, when you look at the data, is what you find, especially in MENA, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa, is very low backward GVC participation. Now, GVC participation is when you have much more trade in intermediate goods than in final goods. This is what's been going on around the world for the last 40 years. But, okay, you could be participating in backward or forward. Now, the forward is what the Sub-Saharan Africa, but also MENA have been participating in. And you'll see the figures in the table in a minute. But the simple observation is whatever they export, whatever value added that is exported by these countries is going into further processing before reaching the consumer. Okay, so forward GVC participation is whatever you export is only intermediate exports that are going to be processed further before they reach the consumer. Now, the backward participation, which is very important, or being judged to be very important for productivity growth, is the amount of imports that are embodied in your exports. So high backward participation means that you have a lot of imports that are embodied in your exports. And that is good in general because a lot of studies have shown that you import, if not innovation and productivity growth, embody that, and that's what you want. So let's look at the data here. Well, you see that you go from 1995 to 2015 because the data in 1990 was not that good. So there we just look at 95 to 2015, and you look at the world average, and you see in the yellow that MENA in Sub-Saharan Africa, they're much lower in backward. They're about half of what it is, half of the world average. And Sub-Saharan Africa also, they're low on backward participation. Now, forward participation, they are high. Of course, the total is the sum of the two, but if you look at the structure, which is what's important, you see that they are above the average on forward, which is what I was mentioning earlier, and you have some figures here. This was the paper we did for ERF, and on ERF, we just looked mostly at the countries in yellow. Those are in MENA, but we also compare with some in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so there is a relatively low content of imports in exports. If you have a low content, it means you have low backward participation. So that is clearly, it's all relative, of course, and we're not saying that anything really new, but we're giving some numbers and a little bit more concreteness in that statement that's been often made. Now, we're not the only ones who have done that. The World Bank had a report on it as well. There are far more studies that can go into the details of it. But that's the part of the broad picture. So now we get into this digitalization. Now, the digitalization, I have the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Took us quite a while to try and see all the elements here because it's a bit confusing. So on the left-hand side is what goes into it, the digitalization. And on the right-hand side is the outcome of it. And the outcome of it is, in general, what is important is that you have a lot of data cross-border development of data. Now, that is the development of data, cross-border development of data is very often, as I said earlier, cannot be measured. So, because it's embodied in the goods. But I mean, that's the outcome. So on the left-hand side, the national data infrastructure, we have a lot of information now, which shows the hard infrastructure, which is ICT. There's information on submarine cables. The countries are getting access to it, the internet exchange points, the co-location data centers, and all that reflected also in the network readiness indicators, which some call national data ecosystem. So on the ICT, MENA is doing pretty well. Sub-Saharan Africa, they still have a ways to go. Now, the soft part of this is the Digitech, and the Digitech is one of the of course, everyone's going to get ICT. It's coming there pretty fast, the hardware, although there are huge challenges in the very low densification, population density in some sub-Saharan African countries, and that's discussed in the paper, and you shouldn't neglect that. But the Digitech part is what is going to happen? 3D printing, machine, artificial intelligence, all this, it could mean that we will be, my colleague Richard Baldwin at Geneva has been mentioning this for a while. Let's suppose now that you have very little labor embodied in trade, basically. And what is trade going to be? Well, it's going to be trade that you're not going to see because a lot of the trade, you'll still have trade in commodities, but a lot of the trade that you're going to see will be, you can't say virtual trade, but trade that doesn't cross the borders. And there, we just don't know yet what will happen. Will computer-aided design lead to reshoring? Well, if it leads to reshoring, it means then that in high-income countries, you're going to be producing at home what was being produced in part in other countries. If you have additive manufacturing, on the other hand, like 3D printing, it means economies of scale will be much less important, and that could really be very positive for manufacturing, developing manufacturing sectors, in particular in Africa, where the size of the market is small. Okay, so there are all these activities on the Digitech side. We just don't know what's going to happen yet. But I mean, there are several papers that have been written, mostly from the standpoint of high-income countries, where we're talking about the substitution of labor with automation. So that could be a huge challenge for Sub-Saharan Africa. But it could also be good because there'll be a reinstatement of labor. Reinstatement of labor is what has happened in the past innovation in the industrialization, where you had a lot of jobs destroyed, but you had new jobs that were created. In fact, the reinstatement of labor effect through new jobs was more important. However, the general feeling is that manufacturing-led development will be harder and services-led development will be easier. So if you look at this picture, that's some of what is discussed in much more detail in the paper. I'm not going to go through that because I don't have the time, but I just want to tell you that this is what I do. So I'll go quickly now because I've been now speaking for already almost 15 minutes. So let me just go very quickly through this. So these are the challenges, okay? Automated mean manufacturing-led development harder, and globalization means that service-led development will be easier. So the question is how much, how can you try and see what might affect the level of digitalization, and it's discussed here. So very quickly, if you look at the mobile usage, and you see the mobile usage in the rest of the world has been growing very rapidly, but the gap between Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA and the rest of the world has not reduced in the last 15 years, whereas MENA has caught up, right, very clearly. And this is for all, but even and especially so for mobile. Okay, so you see that on the hardware side, MENA has done well, but then when you look at data consumption is very high in MENA, but of course the data consumption is not data processing and other activities. And of course, in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's extremely low. So how can you, why is it so low? Well, it's one way you can go about it is use these network readiness index scores. And here we have it. Here we have all the points for MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa. And you see that they are, sometimes they're below, but especially for Sub-Saharan Africa, they're below what might even be expected for the income per capita. And in MENA, not so much, but in some cases, they're also below, very few that are above. But if you just do the big picture, you see in MENA, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, way below, this is the box plots. And the median is in the middle, and that's the interquartile range. You see that Sub-Saharan Africa very low, MENA lower, they are higher than Sub-Saharan Africa, but lower than the average, than the other. Now the other has everything, so it's not very granular, but it's good enough. Okay, and here I have more details on this, and I don't want to go through it, but if you are interested, you can take a look. You can really take a look and see what are some of the digital trade potential for Africa and for MENA. There is quite a bit of granular detail that we might go through. But what you see here, among others, is that in MENA, you see that you look at the GDP per capita and and you see that they are below the average in terms of education and training levels. So for the income per capita, they're below what might be expected. Now, going very quickly, then what has this reflected? Look, you can see that if you have good data, what is good data? Well, good data. Yes, good data centers so that you can be connected, and that means that you can be exporting information services. Now, in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in MENA, it's really transport and tourism part of services, and of course, information services have not developed, and we see that there's a very close link between exports of information services and access to data centers. Now, let's look at it in a little bit more detail. It's this digital preparedness ladder. There we have 65 low and middle income countries. We have most MENA and most Sub-Saharan Africa countries. And let's see where they are. What you have on the top, I don't know if you can read it, but what you do have is the average cost, the cost of internet communication in countries that are in these broad categories. And you see that as you go up the ladder, the average price of broadband is lower. And that means because you're more developed, okay? And then in the next slide, you'll see here the digital into clusters. And the clusters here are those that correspond to the preparedness for digital data connections. And here you go from down the clusters and to the right, you're more developed. Now, very interesting. You look at Djibouti. Now, Djibouti here is a country that has they are connected. All the cables go by there, right? But the cost is extremely high, right? Because it turns out that they have very poor infrastructure, not physical, but policy, meaning by that they have very high, very extreme regulation, monopolies. And when you have the monopoly, then the cost, all the cables are there, but the cost of the digital costs are the highest in the region. Kenya is doing very well, and they have good access, and the cost is not too high because their policies are pretty good. And here, for West African countries, not only, but some of them, if you look at the average rate of taxation of gold in exporters, that is the mining sector in gold exporting countries, is 48%, but it's 68% for mobile communications. So you're taxing more heavily the mobile side. Well, why? Well, because it's relatively easy because the government controls the hardware, the cables. So you tax where you can, but the result is a big handicap. So this is really some of the discussions we have in the paper. And I just finished, I could have put that right at the beginning, but I put it at the end. If you look at the productivity growth, These are compound annual growth rates by region, okay, over the period 1995 to 2008. So this is the productivity growth in manufacturing and services. And you see that in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa, they're very, very low. Okay, so there's really there's an extremely high, there's a very high gap to close. So final thoughts, there are recommendations that I invite you to read, which are in the annexes, because I'm running out of time, of what should be done. There's a nice paper, I think it was done, I don't know for whom, I think it was for Untitled, by Sharok and Mustafa on, it's here. These are the challenges and the bottlenecks which you might take a look at, and they are detailed. So thank you very much. I've taken too long. I hope this little introduction has been helpful. Thank you again.
Well, I mean, you started with a good advantage. We lost some of our guests, so we had all our attention focused on you. The discussant, is with us, Prof. Sarmonai.
Yes.
So, well, I mean, we cannot have open time for you.
Sorry?
We cannot have an open time for you.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll give us 10 minutes. Yeah.
10 minutes. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And greetings, everyone. Thank you, Prof. De Mello, for your excellent paper and presentation, which I read with great interest, very rich in detail. My observations will be of three kinds: conceptual, methodological, and the implications for policy. But maybe I can just start with about 3 days ago, Microsoft Africa announced a new managing director for the Microsoft Africa Transformation Office. And in the announcement, his name is Mr. Kunle Awosika. And in his acceptance and comments, he said, well, I'm passionate about the incredible potential Africa has to become a truly connected continent that exports digital goods and services to the rest of the world. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to meaningfully impact this growth and help unlock the continent's full digital potential. So Microsoft Africa is thinking exactly along the lines that you're thinking in relation to MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that being said, I noticed that so I'm now moving to the conceptual issues, and I might just declare my area of specialization is science, technology, and innovation policy. So I read the paper somewhat with that lens in mind. And so my first observation is that there's a distinction sort of between the role of digitalization in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the concern is primarily employment and the loss of employment due to digitalization led by Chinese firms or driven by Chinese firms. And on the MENA side, it's rather the opportunity for services-led industrialization. And I guess my query initially was, and I never found it in the remainder of the paper, isn't employment loss due to digitalization a challenge in MENA as well? So in other words, it would be a challenge in both Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, and shouldn't services driven industrialization also be an aspiration in Sub-Saharan Africa as it is in MENA? Yes, there might be degrees in emphasis, but it seemed to me that those two dimensions of the challenges of digitalization would apply to both MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa. So perhaps you could assist me in clarifying that. But moving on to the conceptual issues, of course, digital technologies are at the center of this idea of digitalization. And so we could think of technologies as endogenously driven or exogenously driven. Your paper, by and large, was we don't have the technologies in Africa and MENA, so we're essentially going to adopt these technologies developed elsewhere. But that does not preclude some degree of endogenous technological innovation. And as we saw in the 2018 Nobel Prize awarded to Paul Romer and William Nordhaus, about endogenous growth theory, the intentional investment in technological innovation capabilities or technological knowledge, scientific knowledge by domestic firms is the most significant determinant of long-term economic growth. So it seems to me that in this discourse on digitalization, that the efforts by domestic firms would be significant. And you mention it tangentially, but I think one of the implications is that perhaps we can raise that level. So conceptually, the emphasis on exogenous technological development versus endogenous technological development is something that we need to pay attention to. Secondly, on conceptual issues, you do a very good job of distinguishing between digitization, which is essentially conversion of analog documents to digital documents, digitalization, the application of digital technologies to business, but I was looking for digital innovation because that would be needed to respond to existing challenges and new challenges. That's related to digitalization, and I would suggest that that is looking for novel, assuming the technologies are exogenous, it would imply looking for novel business models that are more responsive to local challenges. And the third level, which I think may be useful to consider, is digital transformation for structural transformation. And what do I mean by digital transformation? We may understand this as the application of digital innovation such that it generates or drives a significant or fundamental or structural change in organizations and in society. So digitally transformed firms would be at the center of this digitalization and structural transformation agenda. And I think that may be the missing link, which I'll discuss a little bit more in the methodological discussion. I need to move quickly, I know. One more conceptual query is the issue of comparative advantage in trade needing to be boosted, and maybe moving that a little bit to, and their gains, the loss of gains, as you pointed out, to moving that thinking a little bit to competitive advantage in technological specialization. In other words, what are the low-hanging fruits on the technology side that can enable MENA and Sub-Saharan African countries to apply these technologies in a more cost-effective and more rapid manner? So these are just conceptual queries that I have for you. On the methodological side, I think that was very strong, very thoughtful metrics, measures, indices for thinking about digitalization, the Network Readiness Index, all of that was really very rich and interesting to me. You do have a distinction between inputs, in a very nice graph you showed, inputs and outcomes, inputs being digitech on the sort of hard side, although it has a soft side too, and ICT infrastructure. And then you have on the outcome side, servicification, servitization, structural transformation, offshoring, and so on. And at the center, you have this digitalization. I would suggest that if we're elevating the role of domestic firms, and we're going to hear from Safaricom, a leading firm in that regard, maybe the digitally transformed firms can feature more strongly in that metric, in that schematic. And the outcomes I thought of as really being outputs of a digitalization strategy. The outcomes reflected in the theme of this seminar would relate to growth, poverty reduction, inequality reduction, gender inclusion, absorption of youth employment. And so those implications, of course, not everything can be said in one paper, but I'm just trying to connect the dot to, even if we got these outcomes, what would the outputs, if we got these outputs, what I call outputs, what you call outcomes, what would be the broader societal outcomes be, and how are those connected? So maybe I'll just close now with some of the implications of this the explicitness of the study and the depth of the data presented just inspires many future works along these lines. But perhaps I can just conclude by thinking about the role of technology innovation capabilities in driving digital transformation towards structural transformation in Africa. One is the low-hanging fruit. Given existing technologies that are already on the market, how can we improve the policy landscape? How can we improve the institutional readiness, lower the barriers in the form of excessive taxation and so on, to more rapidly adopt digital technologies, digitalization, for the purpose of achieving some of these outcomes, developmental outcomes that have been outlined. So that would be low-hanging fruit, but that would still not enable us to catch up with, let's say, Southeast and East Asian countries and even more advanced regions of the world. So that implies that secondary and original innovation in the form of a more knowledge-intensive intervention into the digital technologies is needed. That requires human capital and development and so on and so forth. So I think I'll end there. I've my remarks, as I said, of a conceptual nature, methodological nature, and implications for policy. And I'm happy to share my remarks with you in written form, and I'm happy to engage with the participants of this forum. Thank you very much.
No, I think this is wonderful comment. I believe these guys deserve some applause from the room and everyone else. As we listen both to the presentation and also the discussant's intervention, actually it took me back, when we started this project. But then a bit of also what was happening, some of you, if you might remember, the disruptiveness of this emerging technologies. They call it the fourth industrial revolution. Some call it the advent of artificial intelligence, robotics, and also Internet of Things. You know, the world in which this technology is advancing. There was actually a report by the McKinsey which tried to show the percentage of jobs that could be lost because of these emerging technologies in Africa, by taking the cue that as China progressed and wages start to increase, there was this belief about 18 million jobs could come to Africa. I think that was around mid 2015, something that was a big talk. 18 million jobs would come to Africa. So this is the moment to seize and prepare for the continent in terms of light manufacturing, and also using this industrial parks, more or less the same approach of that of China. But then, these disruptive technologies are creating the conditions for even China to become more competitive than it was before, because they continue to apply robots in the factory floors, replacing digital technology in many of the light manufacturing. So they kept on the competition and productivity growing. So for Africa, what is really important now is not to wait for things to shift from Asia to Africa, but rather to catch up and also upgrade our adoption of technology. So I think the point you have raised is more or less towards this: how could we then drive this exogenous shock to the best advantage of Africa? Jem, do you want to say anything to the reflections by our discussant? Or have you already left?
No, I'm still here, but I'm still far away, but I'm still here. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. I want to thank you for these very, very perceptive comments. Right, spot on. You're quite right. What the real world is, this distinction between MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa, I tried to put a distinction where there really isn't one. So I tried to decide, well, just to provoke a little bit, I will say, well, there may be slightly different challenges in the two regions, but of course there's so much diversity that I think you were quite right to say, well, the employment challenge would apply to both. I fully agree. And I also think something that I should have emphasized a little bit more is that this digitalization is going to be quite a bonus for small firms, because small firms now, economies of scale will be much less important. Small firms will be able to develop much more rapidly than they could have before, because market size will not be as important. And that will be very important in countries. You can talk about the African continental free trade area. I'm sorry to say it's not just a lot of talk and talk, because it's very important to have it. But, we'll still have a lot of trade costs and natural barriers to trade. So what you may not have, and you should not have, is data and digital connectedness. And there is some data which shows that the share of small firms in exports has been increasing more rapidly in countries that have had better access better digital access. There is some data that shows that indeed this has been very helpful for small firms, which is an important point that you made. So this digital transformation, as you say in your comments, is going to be helpful for innovation. So I fully agree to that. So the only difficulty, of course, is this is happening and we don't have enough data to see what the difference is yet. And that's all I would add. Very good comments. Thank you very much.
We have still 3 papers ahead of us before breaking for lunch. So I suggest 10 minutes break, or you want to take one more paper and we break? How is it, the group here in the in-person? Still energetic to follow through another paper? Yeah? Okay. If the ladies say yes, that's a wonderful signal for me. Okay, so let's just go. Perhaps if there is anyone also to comment on James' paper, I can allow a few minutes from here in the room, as well as those of us attending in virtually. You can comment on James' paper. If not, then let me just invite our colleagues from MENA, Professor Isaac Atias. Okay, I think I may also want to say a few things. These first 2 papers, we call them framework papers. These are designed to provide more methodological also approach to the country case studies. So Jem and Isaac have been working on this. So that's why it's a bit more cross-country, covering Sub-Saharan Africa or MENA or both. So my apologies for that. So is it Isaac or Mark who is presenting?
It will be Isaac.
Yes, Isaac. You are
yes.
most welcome. Yeah, good.
Where Mark lives,
you.
it's 4 o'clock in the morning now, so I will make the presentation.
Oh my gosh.
You can hear me, no?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy to be here. This is a joint paper with Mark Dutz from the World Bank. I'm retired actually from Sabancı University. I live in Portugal at the moment. This is a comparative analysis of one dimension of digitization, which is of mobile internet uptake and use across countries in MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa. So do I share my screen, or how do we do this? I presume I can share my screen, no? Let's see. Okay, just 1 second. I'm sorry, I'm having
Good to share, yeah. If you need assistance, we can help from this side. Yeah, we can see the. Yes, Isaac. It's projected. Nice.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes, it's okay.
So it's okay now. Okay, wonderful. Okay, I can enlarge this, and I am assuming it's still okay. Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Okay. Sorry about this delay here. Okay. So the motivation of the paper is we examine drivers and correlates of adoption and use of mobile internet. We focus on mobile internet, or actually it's unique subscriptions of mobile internet. Because this is GSMA data, which is available across many countries and for a sufficiently long period of time. And we use it, or we also like it because, especially in many countries that we're focusing on, a lot of users use more than one SIM card. So there's a non-uniqueness, and the GSMA data takes care of that. It measures number of unique subscriptions. So this is the measure that we use. And mobile internet here is treated as a key access technology, enabling many of the benefits of digitization. That's why we focus on unique mobile internet. We present in the paper, I'm not going to get into it here, a survey of main findings regarding the benefits of digitization in low-income countries. There's a lot of evidence now. Some of it is causal, summarized in the paper. Some of it is still in the form of correlations, or controlled correlations, but still suggestive. And the evidence suggests that there is indeed a benefit in terms of jobs or higher income, or welfare in terms of increased consumption and reduced poverty of digitization. So we take that as given, as a background in the paper, and since there is increasing evidence of benefits of digitization, we look at adoption and use. We focus on 3 regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, which is 48 countries, North Africa, which is Djibouti, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and non-rich Middle East countries, which are listed here. This is a cross-country study, and we have to warn that there is missing data for a lot of variables, and whatever statistical analysis that has been carried out in the paper was carried out on the largest possible data sets for each of the variables, each of the correlates of adoption of unique mobile internet. So what are the main findings? Let me start with main findings for a few slides, and then we can get into some of the more details if we still have time. The first main finding is what we call an uptake gap. What do we mean by that? So while there remains a significant gap in the coverage of 4G networks relative to the frontier, this is especially true for countries in the Sub-Saharan Africa, even though there's a large variance. I'll come to that in a minute. Still, 3G is much more available in terms of infrastructure. And we find that a significant part of the population have not adopted mobile internet in all 3 regions, but especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, even though it is available. We call this the uptake gap. So at least in the long run, the uptake gap seems to be more critical than what we call coverage. In other words, availability of the infrastructure. Data that I will try to summarize later shows us that in many countries, there is coverage of especially 3G, which is internet enabling, but uptake or adoption is less, or quite much less than coverage. Number 2, low incomes. The level of income explains a large portion of the variation of unique mobile internet uptake across countries. In fact, when you do a simple regression over the last 10 years, and as a dependent variable, you use unique mobile internet uptake, as the independent variable, one uses GDP per capita by itself, squared and cubed. That regression itself explains roughly 70% of variation of uptake across countries. So income is crucial. It's a very important correlate of mobile internet uptake. So low incomes and poverty is a major affordability barrier that prevents rapid uptake of mobile internet. Then we look at demand and supply correlates of uptake. We spend quite a bit of time looking at different drivers that have been shown to be important in other studies. And we look at how these countries fare in terms of these drivers. On the demand side, affordability and capabilities are crucial. By affordability, we mean both low incomes and relatively high prices. It turns out that prices in these countries are high in absolute levels, but significantly high relative to incomes. As you will see, ITU has a variable, the price relative to gross national GNI, and that is very high in especially Sub-Saharan Africa. Second, lack of affordable electricity, especially in the SSA, is very important, and low levels of capabilities or skills are critical barriers. Attractiveness or lack of willingness to use of internet and related digital services is also a barrier, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, based especially on the subjective response of many non-users, indicating that they either don't know what internet is. This is a little bit old data now. It's 2018 RIA data. So things may have changed since then, and we're going to have a new set of RIA data coming soon, hopefully this year. So we will see whether some of these findings have changed now. But there is, based on microdata, either they don't know what internet is, or they don't know how to use it, or they don't find it useful. There is also evidence of significant network effects, which means that a person is more likely to adopt mobile internet if friends have already adopted. On the supply side, low levels of competition are a major barrier to uptake. And this, in our study, is captured by both high levels of concentration, which we measure by the Hirschman-Hirschfeld index, and high levels of mobile termination rates, which is a key indicator of regulatory stance, as we explain in detail in the paper. And we have also find some evidence that a tough competitive environment also seems to play a role. What do we mean by that? Especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, the countries seem to suffer from a high level of incidence of exits of mobile network operators relative to other regions. So many network operators leave business more frequently in Sub-Saharan African countries relative to other countries. This is not in the paper, but we think it's a nice summary of some of these key drivers. So we have here capabilities, prices, regulatory stance, and electricity. And on each of those, North Africa, non-rich Middle Eastern countries, but especially Sub-Saharan Africa, are lacking behind other regions. For example, learning adjusted years of schooling. This is from the World Bank Human Capital Index. That's only 5 years in Sub-Saharan Africa, 7.8 years in Latin America, for example. Higher also in North Africa and non-rich Middle Eastern countries. Prices, as percent of GNI, it's really high in Sub-Saharan Africa, very high. High also relative in USD terms, but much higher than in terms of percent of GNI. Regulatory index, ITU has an index of overall ICT regulation, according to that index, Sub-Saharan Africa does not look very bad, actually. But as we explain in the paper, that index captures de jure regulation. In other words, whether the laws and regulations exist or not. And we know from studies of the regulation that de jure does not always reflect what's actually happening in the field, de facto. We take a measure, mobile termination rates as a measure of de facto regulatory stance, and that is still quite high in Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also very high in East Asia. East Asia is doing very well with respect to most of the other indicators, but it's not doing very well with respect to mobile termination rates. And finally, electricity. A lot of micro studies see that, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, access to electricity is a key driver of mobile internet. And we can see why access to electricity overall, this is WDI data, is just below 50% in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is just average across countries, whereas it's well over 90% in most of the regions. So electricity seems to be a key barrier. This is a complementary asset. It's a key barrier to adoption. Policy actions. We conclude that the critical role of the demand side factors strongly suggest that increasing the degree of competition in digital markets, while important, will not by itself be sufficient to generate widespread adoption of mobile internet and attendant digital services. Especially greater productive use with associated jobs increase and poverty reduction benefits. We stress that policy actions will be needed on multiple fronts, including public and private investments in general education and business relevant skills, including digital skills, and in complementary infrastructure, especially in electricity wherever access is lacking, in addition to supply side pro-competition policies. And maybe not, we do emphasize this in the paper, but maybe we should have emphasized more. Policy actions will also be needed to support entrepreneurs to design skills-appropriate digital applications that can be productively used by households and firms that lack the necessary skills to use existing applications. So there is a skills gap, and that can be closed in two ways. You can increase skills, or you can generate applications which are more accommodating of the existing level of skills. And we suggest that both should be done. A few let me see. Yeah, a few of the papers of the data. As we can see, there has been quite an increase in 3G networks in the last few years in Sub-Saharan Africa, but 4G networks is still lagging behind. This is in the paper. However, uptake is seriously lagging coverage, both in 3G and in 4G. And what we call unique mobile internet uptake is below 30% in Sub-Saharan Africa and about 38% in non-rich Middle Eastern countries and 44% in North Africa. And this is the uptake gap. This is the uptake gap, which we define as 1 minus the ratio of unique mobile internet subscriptions to 3G plus coverage. And as you can see, it's very high in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it has actually increased in 2020. It's close to 70%. That's what we call the uptake gap. But we also show that within region variation of uptake is very high, as you can see in this graph. The green is North African countries, red is non-rich Middle Eastern countries, and blue is Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a huge variation. You know, mobile internet is close to 50% in Mauritius and below 10% in Eritrea, or just above 10% in Central African Republic and Somalia. So variation is very large, and policy, of course, should focus on this high variation as well. This is the regression we ran just to show that, okay, this table shows two things. One, if you can see, this is the dependent variable on the fourth column is mobile internet uptake. And we put in some dummies for regions, and we also include GDP per capita squared and cubed. As you can see, R squared is 71%, explaining a large part of the variation. And Sub-Saharan Africa is, the coefficient for that dummy variable is negative and significant, saying that Sub-Saharan Africa is lagging even after you control for low incomes. So it's not just low incomes. Low incomes are important, but there is more going on, as we have tried to explain in terms of the key drivers. How am I doing? Do I have 5 more minutes? Hello? Okay. But let me skip that graph. So conclusion, the paper emphasizes the importance of policies to address the challenges of low uptake, with uptake essential for greater productive use and associated jobs increases and poverty reduction benefits. It provides a framework highlighting the importance for uptake of both demand side factors, affordability, capabilities, and attractiveness factors, and supply side, which is policy and regulatory factors affecting the degree of market competition. While we do conclude, just to repeat myself, that while there are competition issues, low incomes seem to be a key barrier. Also, anticipating papers that are going to be presented later in the day, the paper raises further questions that require further country-level research to support the design of policies to support greater uptake, including their effects on jobs and poverty. For example, to better understand the large degree of heterogeneity across countries and sub-regions within countries, across industries, and across digital technologies beyond internet that differentially affect relative importance of different factors influencing uptake. At the industry level, across heterogeneity across agriculture, manufacturing, and services, and also in terms of technology, those affecting general business functions and those affecting sector-specific business functions, such as in agriculture, irrigation, harvesting, and packaging for crop-based agriculture. Let me stop here and thank you for listening.
Very, very interesting results. So we have Dr. Miriam, Executive Director of the Africa Policy Institute, to discuss this paper. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. And I would like to thank the authors for the very good presentation, because you're talking about digitalization in MENA and then Sub-Saharan African countries. What I find very interesting, and I just picked it out, is that it is a very wide scope with a lot of layered issues. And I like that one of the things that has been said is that there's a lot going on in the area of digital technologies, and when we are looking at mobile internet uptake. And because the way the paper has been organized and the findings, I will go with the findings and also bring out a bit of issues about data and conceptualizations. I'll give a full writing of some of the comments. I think it's a very good starting point of what we can look at, and even going to the recommendations where we need to now look at issues of heterogeneity across countries and sub-regions, and I'm particularly focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa. So if I look at the issues of low uptake gaps, and having discussed about the supply side issues, one of the reasons why you find there are also low uptake gaps, look at our value chains and how they are developed. If we go to agriculture and even go by subsectors, then cost of doing business. Where are the businesses going to, or the business owners going to try to adopt these technologies when they're still trying to survive at that low level? So the issue of income really comes out very clearly. And then, all right. So I like the way it's been said there are very many layered issues that are taking place. Secondly, competition also in the market. And there was a comment about network operators living faster. That is very true. And we look at competition, but again, it is very important that we disaggregate this data by countries, which is a good recommendation that has been given. Because when we talk about competition, what are the policies in place? How do we define competition in the mobile internet market? That is very important. And even as we've talked about mobile internet, there's also the question of internet first. But before we go to internet, let's talk about the mobile telephony they use. What type of phones are we using? Because in Kenya right now, you can actually use mobile technology without even using smartphones, the SSD phones. Are we able to differentiate this kind of usage in this report? I know it's already advanced, but these are questions that can be brought later. Availability of 4G, 3G, 2G, and even going downwards to the old technologies. There are countries which are advanced, which even have 5G. But how about countries where even 3G is still a problem? Because in Kenya, you will have 4G, but when you go to certain West African countries, even 2G is still a problem. And even for us, taking the example of Kenya, how about even in the ASAL regions, where some people have to go up to certain hills to even get mobile data? So that is just still another issues that I'm seeing. The demand side also, we've talked about affordability, capabilities. Most of our activities or most of the African countries are still, majority are in the low income or middle income. But if you look at more, affordability of internet, there are so many considerations that need to be made because it is a very complementary good. It has to go with mobile phones and the type of mobile phones. Let us look at even mobile phone usage and penetration. And smartphones, as I already said, is a very good example. I've seen the comment on electricity, and electricity is very important. But I think when you come to Sub-Saharan Africa, I would like to talk about off-grid and on-grid energy sources. Because when you talk about electricity, the coverage might be low or weak. But when we talk about off-grid and on-grid, I don't know how this data was aggregated or disaggregated because we've talked of data issues. How about the use of solar energy? Because most of the technologies that are being used now, you find people are using solar energy. So perhaps putting solar energy or the source of solar as a source of power would make a difference. Electricity costs are still high. In most African countries, there are monopolies. So, and Kenya, a good example, you only have to use, it's only Kenya Power that we have, whether you like it or not. It is the only source of energy, whether efficient and with good costs, that is what we have. But if we bring in renewable sources, I think we can get some better insights. I know data was a big problem, but something that should come out of recommendations, how can we talk about data collection for issues of digital technology, just beyond working with what we have with World Bank, because you find the data in as much as you might get households or they are mixed households and farms. I think it's important that we now start differentiating because we are talking farms, so we are talking about businesses. So those are some of the initial comments. Then, well, I don't want to focus on it right now, but conceptualization when you're doing the analysis, because we are assuming that this is a one-step process. You just wake up and use mobile internet. Where do you start? Education matters, capabilities, you've talked about it. And I've seen the variables that have been used. In this case, you've talked about, I think there is primary, there is secondary, but how about if we even differentiate it to tertiary, and between secondary and tertiary, there are different levels. These are things that we can talk about and even look at very well. Affordability, again, is very important. We are talking about incomes. We know that poverty levels are still high. So how do we talk about affordability and layer it very well also with mobile phone usage, what type of mobile phone that you use, at the same time, also with mobile internet usage. So in terms of conceptualization, while the data is very good and the presentation is very good and gives a lot that we can discuss or even follow up in future research, conceptualization should have been a very strong component here that can be used even as we develop more papers. Those are my comments for starters. Thank you.
No, these are very, very precise, actually, comments. And I hope Isaac and his colleague, as they finalize for publication, they take these comments into account. So colleagues, let's really show our appreciation for both Isaac and Dr. Miriam. So before I give to Isaac what he thinks about the comments, anybody here?
We have comments online.
Okay,
comments.
so you can, you can ask them to intervene, please.
The first question from Virela Alberto, he asks, how to deal both with preference for open source digital tools and eventual interest in protecting African intellectual property rights concerning digital innovation. And the second question is, can application of electricity and big data analytics bring an acceleration in digital transformation in Sub-Saharan Africa? So those are the two questions.
Thank you. I think these are quite useful and highly related challenges, constraints we have in Africa. Yeah, you want to come in again? Yeah, Miriam, okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't talk about it. We are talking about digitalization and we are doing comparatives. How about the youth, tech startups, and mobile internet use? Because that's a niche that we really need to think about. We are having a new generation who don't work 8 to 5. They're always on their phones. They're always on the internet. They're always trying to be creatives, very creative. So that could be something we could look at, but data allowing as well. Thank you.
No, I think these are very good comments, and I may also add, Isaac, I think this is interesting because it's close to home and to our everyday life. In a companion project, we call it data governance in Africa. One of, I think, the findings and concerns many people have raised is really this continued gap in terms of accessing data as well, information, because of the, as you mentioned, yes, low uptake on internet, but even those who have internet, the bandwidth and many other infrastructures that go along with it prohibits, for instance, application and usage of softwares or others that require a lot of space and other, especially for young people who want to, I think Miriam mentioned, startups and others could be a challenge. So it's more or less the constraints are in many dimensions. So during this time, there is a comparative advantage being lost also when you don't have proper data governance rules in the country. So if you want to comment on that as well, that would be fine. So Isaac, you have a bit of some questions. You don't need to answer all of them. You can thank us, but I give the floor to you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Molo. These are really wonderful comments, very insightful. I'll try to respond to a few of them. You have, Dr. Omala, underlined again the importance of heterogeneity, and I cannot agree with you more. You see it very clearly in the data, in even the aggregate data. And of course, aggregate data conceals heterogeneity at the country level. And we know that there is tremendous heterogeneity within countries, across regions, across rural versus urban, from studies that use microdata as well. This study that we have done has relied mainly on aggregate data to be able to do cross-country analysis and comparison of regions. A lot of the questions, relevant questions, cannot be answered with data at this level of aggregation. For example, different sources of energy. This is extremely important, on-grid versus off-grid. The data that we use for electricity comes from the World Development Indicators of the World Bank, and it's a valid question. How is it exactly measured? Does it capture all sorts of electricity that can be available through off-grid sources? And I really don't know the answer to that. Fortunately, there is increased availability over time of microdata. And here I would like to mention especially data that has been provided by a series of surveys carried out by Research ICT Africa, RIA, that we have used, and that some of the papers that are going to be presented later have used extensively. And that kind of data, it's very difficult to do cross-country comparisons, but it's very rich. It has very rich information within countries. For example, you have mentioned age, and it's very difficult to capture the importance of age, the role of young people, just by looking at aggregate data. But when you use, excuse me, when you use microdata, you see that being young matters tremendously in terms of mobile internet uptake. Young people adopt mobile internet much more frequently relative to older people, even after controlling for education. Even controlling for education, age seems to matter. So very important variable. I completely agree. And that kind of data also helps. You have, sorry, let me backtrack for a moment. You've mentioned the importance of different types of handsets. Extremely important because we know that this is a very important cost factors, and also that there are new technologies, cheaper stuff coming out, and this is changing very frequently. We hope that new coming micro level data will provide some information on handsets as well, but it's a key variable that unfortunately we cannot control just by looking at aggregate data. What else can I say? Maybe one explanation of uptake gaps, this is how I understand what you said, one explanation of uptake gaps could be obtained when we look at value chains and things like cost of doing business. I completely agree. And how do we expect businesses to adopt mobile internet when they're still trying to survive? And there, I think the emphasis that we want to put on skills appropriate applications, for example, for agriculture. I think we're going to hear more about this later today, seems to be important. A lot of the available applications are meaningful for certain languages and for people that have acquired at least a threshold level of skills, and it may be possible to go beyond that with appropriate environments and policies. Big data analytics, whether it can be useful, it's already starting to be useful as far as I can see, especially with applications that have been developed for agriculture. So it's an important, and data management obviously is, we haven't really touched upon it in our report, but it's clearly a key variable. I completely agree. The forthcoming flagship report from the World Bank on technology adoption and the recent WDR and has a lot to say about the importance of data governance. Let me stop here and thank you again for very insightful comments.
I have one question, maybe a couple of questions from our participants. One is the ambassador at large for the Africa Plan in the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the question is quite interesting: how to deal both with preference for open source digital tools and the eventual interest in protecting African intellectual property rights concerning digital innovation. Is it okay? The second question is, yeah, I think you answered this one. It's more like application of electricity and big data analytics. So no need for that one. Maybe you want to address the first one about open source applications and the need to protect innovations by African property rights for African entrepreneurs and innovators. You are muted, Isaac.
Okay.
Isaac, you are muted.
I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much for reminding me. This is a very valid question, and my answer would be that there should be a preference for protection of intellectual property with respect to entrepreneurial activities for design of digital applications within Africa. So it's like almost as an infant industry argument. I agree with the overall necessity and desirability of open source digital tools, but you're not going to get a lot of entrepreneurial activity within Sub-Saharan Africa in these fields unless you have some level of intellectual property rights. That's how I would like to respond to this. Unless it can be this issue of returns to these types of activities can be dealt with through designs with public interventions that could substitute for intellectual property. But until that's available, I think intellectual property is important for the support of these types of activities. I don't know if this answers the question.
I mean, you gave it. So thank you so much. I believe we may have now to take a break. It's 12 noon here in Nairobi. Elsewhere, of course, in Portugal, maybe you are 2 hours behind, but still time for coffee. So colleagues, we break just for a short one, have tea, coffee, and we'll be back and take the last paper for the morning session. So let's not take too much time, please. I appreciate so far the participation. Thank you so much. Is there any announcements, Scholar? We have the coffee and tea out there. For those of us in, okay, Scholar, go ahead.
Yes, because of for the sake of the online participants, we take 10 minutes. There's coffee and some snacks outside. Thank you.
for coming back. Still, I see everyone is here. And hopefully those attending virtually. Yeah, thank you very much. So the next presentation is we start with the country case studies. We have now Professor Alamayo Gada presenting on opportunities and challenges of disruptive technologies on growth in Ethiopia, with a focus on services sector that are vulnerable to disruptive technology. So we give him the floor. He's right here.
Be nice for me to read and let me see somewhere here.
Okay, so no, you can.
Thanks.
And use the mic, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Good. Can I start now?
Yes. They're waiting. Yeah.
What is that? Where am I going? Is finished?
It's okay. Don't worry. You're
Yeah.
starting.
Good. Okay. Good. Thank you very much. My name is Alamayo Geda. I came from Addis Ababa University. I'm pretty much a macroeconomist. I got 15 minutes, so I got about 18 slides. I'm gonna be fast, a little fast. What I did was basically to see what the impact of disruptive technologies, and in this particular case, disruptive is defined for the Ethiopian case study as digitalization in the financial sector. So that was basically the focus. But before that, I just want to see, what is the general impact of digitalization in the economy, because at the end of the day, even if I'm picking a particular the financial sector, the banking sector, in Ethiopia, financial sector is pretty much banking sector. And even within the banking sector, the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, which is the public bank, dominates everything. It accounts for 65% of the loans and deposits, about 60% of the assets, and about 50% of the capital. Therefore, seriously speaking, when you talk about the banking sector in Ethiopia, you're basically talking about the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, which is a public bank. But the general digital ecosystem is very much important for the banking or the financial sector. Why? Because if the telecom is poor, if the telecom service is very expensive, and related infrastructure such as electricity is has a problem of providing good service, it will affect the individual banks and the financial sector. Therefore, I tried to see what is the macro impact in general. So for that, what I did was I ran some regressions. This is the picture of the financial sector in Ethiopia generally. You have the national or the central bank at the top, and we have two public banks. One is Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. The other one is Development Bank of Ethiopia, pretty much a policy bank. And we have about 18 now private commercial banks, and a number of, I think 5 or 6 new banks are still on the process of being established. We have about 18 insurance firms and 41 microfinance institutions. As you can see from that picture, 60% of the assets of the banking system is owned by the commercial bank, leaving for the other private banks about 40% of it. And in terms of capital, also half of the capital is owned by Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. So this is pretty much the picture of the financial sector. Now, before studying this, what I did was I this again shows you the capital and the branch network is still dominated by the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. Now, before I go detail on this one, what I did was I ran, oh, sorry. I don't know which direction this thing is going. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I hope I'm going back. It doesn't look like it's going back because I'm pressing this or this. Can you help me? Please take it to the first place. Go again. Font, which is one? Font, oh, this is font. You sure? Read it for me, please. If you can help me. It's not handy. Okay, please, next. Okay, this gives you a picture of the economic growth in the last 5 years. And basically, if you see the last 20 years, the Ethiopian economy is growing very, very, very fast. On the average, 9% per annum for consecutive 15 years. Although we don't believe, that figure. As economists, the government says that. I believe it's a bit exaggerated, but at least 6-7% is that is a guy from the government next to me here. A friend, fortunately a friend. Okay. Anyway, it was, by the African standards, very high, comparable to the Sub-Saharan Africa growth of the high growth period. So we did quite okay. Now, when you see this is the indicator of some of the indicators of the digitalization in the country. If you see mobile per person, you can see mobile per 100 inhabitants, which was just 43 2015, has jumped to 54.3 today, but still very low by comparison in the region. In particular, when you compare it to Kenya, it's very, very low. Internet and data is extremely low, by 100%. It was 10 some 6 years ago, now about 24. Fixed line is it's a general trend across the continent because the others are replacing it. What happened?
There you are.
Good. Can you go to next, please? So you're getting this. It's the same problem. You're going back. Okay, let me talk about this. This is the government's strategy of digitalization. The government has picked 4 sectors as a focus of digitalization. One is agriculture, and to unleash the value from agriculture using digitalization. The next one is global in terms of the manufacturing sector, to put it in the global value chain and to use digitalization, digital transformation for that purpose. And the third focus of the government strategy is the government digital strategy is building the IT-enabled service sector. And the fourth one is digital as the driver of tourism. These are they already picked, and the government has already designed a digital strategy until 2025, and this is the focus of the government. Next, please. Now, so before having this in the paper, I have discussed all this in detail, but having this one, what I did was let me see at a general level the impact of digitalization on economic growth. So I just fitted a simple solo growth model where I defined the total factor productivity, among other things, is a function of digitalization. So I used labor, capital, and estimated this equation, and I got some interesting result at a general level. Next one, please. So what I did was, next, please. This is what I got. Now, what I got here is interesting in the sense that, number one, the impact of digitalization on growth is very, very strong. I think a 1% growth in digitalization measured by mobile subscription brings about 0.5% growth in GDP. But again, the second interesting result, it varies across sectors. It is huge in the service sector and very limited, extremely limited in the agriculture sector, which makes sense. I think top, and the second one is when I use broadband subscription as an indicator of digitalization, I found the economic significance of the number very small. From previously the elasticity was 0.05, now it becomes 0.03. So I think the mobile thing is more important in terms of catalyzing the growth than the broadband subscription. And as you see here, also the service sector impact is almost 1%, almost 0.1 for 10% growth. The growth impact on the service sector GDP is almost 1%. For the general GDP is 0.5%, and for agriculture 0.03. So the impact varies. Next, please. Now, this is the short trend result. So those of you who you can have a look at it, the short trend result. That one is the longest because I fit this autoregressive distributed lag models. So this one is the short trend result. Let's next, please. Sorry. Next. So once I have this general picture of, okay, I know pretty much what the impact of this thing is on the globe, the GDP, the growth of the economy, then I went to specific case studies. For that, what I did was I picked the dominant bank, commercial bank, as I told you, is dominant in terms of deposits, lending, 65% of the banking sector is dominated by that. And in terms of assets, 60%, in terms of capital, 40%. So if I study what is digitalization in the commercial bank of Ethiopia, I pretty much get an idea of what digitalization, number one. Then also I took like the top 5 private bankers, private commercial bankers, and I did a key informant interview with them, and I tried to collect also data on digitalization from these firms. So the result of that analysis is the following. Next, please. Oh, okay, I already said that. Next, please. Good. Now, if you see generally the financial sector in Ethiopia, but I compared it to Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, and I found it in general, the conclusion is by all measures, the Ethiopian financial sector is the lowest in terms of all indicators compared to the region, except in some areas with Malawi. And in particular, when you compare it to Kenya, it's hugely below the level of Kenya. Like if you see, the account penetration rate, the CPI financial sector indicator, domestic credit to the private sector, in all these measures, it is very low. The only place where it is better is in terms of risk premium on lending rate minus treasury bill rate, it has the lowest. Otherwise, regionally, it is its performance is the lowest. Next, please. And in terms of the same in terms of digitalization, particularly I want you to compare with Kenya. They're all like internet payment system, digital payment system, mobile money account. Ethiopia, as you see it in the left, Burundi and Ethiopia is way below the countries in the region. Next, please. Good. This is the case study. What I thought is this way. We have disruptive technology in the financial sector. That's what I want to study. Forms and level of disruption technology, digitalization in the financial sector. This has like, what is the digitalization in core banking, IT, payment system, and other fintech products. Then I try to see what is the positive effects, opportunities of this, and what are the negative effects of this, and that has implication for financial sector business model. that usually I assumed from the literature that if digitalization is disruptive, it will change the business model of banks. If it doesn't, it is not affecting them. I mean, it's a good example for me is Uber, say in Kenya, or in Ethiopia, we call it Ride. Before that, in Ethiopia, we have small taxis working. And now the moment Uber comes, completely the business model is changing. Therefore, those taxis, the traditional taxis, either to adopt the new business model or they are out of business. So I've assumed from the literature that is the concept of disruptive technology I have. Now, the question is whether the digitalization, whatever digitalization we have in Ethiopia, does it have an effect on business model of banks? That's what I was trying to answer. Good. Next, please. Now, then I tried to collect data from the banks, the commercial bank, as I told you, the dominant, and the other 4 top private banks, which account for more than 50% of the private banks, asset, loans, and what have you. So I picked them, and then I tried to see the trend. Now, what are my indicators like? The use of ATM, POS machines, mobile banking users, internet banking users, number of card holders, ATM transactions per year, and internet transaction customer. So I picked all this and I compared the period 2008-2019 to 2020-21. Generally, from this table, the conclusion is there is significant growth in all these indicators. For instance, if you take the CBE and the ATM use, the users, which were 2.5 million, jumped to 3 million. Again, POS use, it was 3,000, it jumped to 4,000. And mobile bank users, this is very important indicator, which used to be 2.3 million, jumped to 6.6 million. So in all indicators here, I see significant growth in these payment systems. Next, please. Now, I try to compare this with Kenyan banks, because for me, Kenya, the level of financial development, fortunately, Rose is here. Rose did some excellent stuff on the Kenyan financial system, published in ART long time ago. And I use that paper very much because it shows you what happened to the banking sector in Kenya in the 80s and the 90s. And there is an excellent book published on digitalization in Kenya, banking system, which shows you the latest, what happened. So if you take Rose's paper, Rose is here, and that paper, it can give you the idea of how the digitalization has gone in Kenya. So for me, Kenya is a good benchmark to compare it. So what I found interesting in this comparison, here I took the Equity Bank. In the next slide, I have the Commercial Bank of Kenya. Now, when I compare that, what I found is that some of the indicators that the Ethiopian banks use to show success are not success indicators in Kenya. For instance, an increase in the number of ATM is not a success indicator in Kenya. In Ethiopia banking system, when the ATM goes up, they just climb. We're doing great. Not in Kenya. Or agent banking, if you see the trend, even agent banking is stagnating in Kenya. And if you see the trend, even the agent banking is going down, the top one. Then merchant POS stagnated pretty much, declining actually. The ATM is declining, as you see, and merchant POS is stagnating. So all this, why that? Because the Kenyans are moving to more digital payment system. So in Ethiopia, there is the reverse. These things are going, branch is expanding, ATM is expanding, and it is considered as a success indicator. This contrast is important. I'll come to that next. What is the implication of that for the business model? Good. Then I talked to, after collecting this information, I had a discussion, a key informant discussion with the IT department guys in these banks, as well as with the CEO of these banks. And the conclusion I came up are the following. Number one, the Ethiopian business model is basically based still based on branch banking model and focusing on customers, big customers, as well as customers that have access to foreign exchange, like NGOs and what have you. So that is their business model. Everything is pretty much 90% served at branch level. Second, they focus on big firms. And third, they focus on those firms that have access to foreign exchange, because we have serious foreign exchange shortage, almost rationing for the last 5 years. So that was the business model they have. And by contrast, when you see the Sub-Saharan African thing, the trend is towards going more micro and small firms finance, and the focus is more on digitalization instead of the branch system. That's number one conclusion. The second conclusion, one of the major problems that I observed in Ethiopia for digitalization and the banking sector, as I told you, the banking sector is pretty much the financial sector in that country, is lack of methods or tools to measure the impact of investing on digitalization. You know, when the managers go to the board, the boards want to give as much dividend as possible to make the bank very attractive. And therefore, you cannot exactly show what the impact of digitalization to the board to convince them so that they will allow to invest on digitalization. So that I found from this study a major problem. Third, the current business model of Ethiopia banks is focused on big customers, as I told you, and corporate entities that are all of them are handled in branch. This is the opposite of the trend in the continent. This, for me, shows me that digitalization doesn't bring about any business model change in Ethiopia. I concluded from that. So it doesn't really lead them to change their business model. Next, please. Fourth, adopting advanced level global and financial digitalization and venturing on digital transformation of banking as a strategy is not observed, basically, in substantive manner in Ethiopia, despite the growth of all these digital indicators. And one of the major challenge every CEO told me is that the regulator is far behind in terms of properly regulating and supervising digital products in the country. So what does that mean? The regulator is very weak. As it has a list of things to be done, permissible things to be done. And if you as a bank innovate and come up with innovative products, it takes you 1 or 2 years to get approval. So by the time you get approval, the product is obsolete, basically. So I found the regulator is very stifling and they are very strict, very in a narrow margin, and they don't allow financial bankers and the emerging small fintechs to be innovative and bring that product to the market. So unless that, and then if you try to convince, they're not accountable for that either. They held the progress, and then they're not accountable. Sometimes in some of CEOs told me that they could be even reprisal if you try to be hard on them. So that I found that's a very stifling regulatory environment. Can you go next, please? I already said that. There are also a number of areas that enhance digitalization, the financial, but needs to be taken collectively. Another problem is especially in some products that come from global vendors, every bank is handling it individually. But if they do collectively, one, it would have minimized it enormously, the cost. The second one, there are, like sovereignty and national security issues, because if you are completely controlled by a global vendor, you could be threatened in terms of national security. So a lot of banks express that with these things, securing some digital and financial products from global vendors, if it had been handled collectively at national level, that would have been the best. So that's the suggestion I got. Conclusion. Except in a few banks, I found only one, actually, one bank. The disruptive technology nature of digitalization doesn't seem to have any implication on changing the business model of most banks in Ethiopia. And another final interesting point I found is, in Ethiopia, when you see nobody for the outsiders could be difficult. For the insiders behind the banks, it is ethnic-based banking. I can tell Bank A, it belongs to a particular ethnic group, dominated, and Bank C, dominated by a particular ethnic group. But there are also multi-ethnic banks which have multi-ethnic clients. And increasingly now, also there is religious banks are emerging, religious-based banks are emerging. Protestants, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and what have you. So therefore, the concern of some of the multi-ethnic based banks is that these are taking customers away from them. And digitalization, in particular, Safaricom is moving to Ethiopia, and other digital bank-based are coming to Ethiopia. So they believe that this digitalization, by allowing competition, may lead to mergers of this ethnic banks and could have a positive effect on them. That's pretty much what I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very interesting paper. Dr. Ben, we have him here. Oh, yeah. Yes, the discussant.
Thank you.
Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor, for a very interesting paper. I went through it and I realized it's quite, it has a lot of detail. Basically, it's looking at digitalization as a major disruptive technology in Ethiopia. And this is against the background that digitalization is at a fairly low level within Ethiopia. And whereas it acknowledges that, it agrees, it puts out the point that digitalization is growing within Ethiopia, although not very fast. It's actually one of the slowest within the region. Now, the paper, the way it is structured, I saw it as an omnibus of several things. First of all, it discusses the journey of digitalization in Ethiopia. It then highlights the importance of disruptive technologies in bringing about structural transformation of the economy and its impacts. Now, one of the things I grappled with from the very beginning is that disruptive technology and digitalization seems to have been equated. And whereas digital technology may not necessarily be disruptive, it is largely seen as disruptive. On the other hand, disruptive technology is not exactly digitalization. You can have other technologies which are non-digital in nature. So along the way, I think that distinction was brought out, but it will be good to probably bring it much earlier to avoid a scenario as I had, whereby you get very confused at the very beginning as to whether the two have been equated. So it looks at the impact of digitalization within the Ethiopian financial sector. And Professor has mentioned, the Ethiopian financial sector is kind of skewed in a particular direction, public sector, and there is one large bank which basically does a lot of things, and that is what becomes basically the subject of the case study. Now, I'm approaching this with a business background, and therefore my lens, I'm looking at it with the lens of business innovation. And so when I look at the discussion and the distinction it looks at digital technologies as enabling the various models, new business models. It can cause intermediation and obviously give a chance for customer centricity. The fact that digitalization is moving slowly within Ethiopia does not mean that there's no other innovation that is going on. The authors acknowledge that. The author acknowledges that there are other types of innovation, incremental innovation that are going on within Ethiopia. Now, I have a detailed report which I'll not go through for purposes of time, but I just want to highlight a few specific things which I thought probably could be important from the perspective of the presentation of today. When we look at what is the impact of digitalization, I'm glad there's been some models which have been done, very novel models, whereby we're able to pin the growth within digitalization using some dummy variables and its impact on the gross domestic product of the economy. And this has been done not only for the financial sector, but it has also been done for the other sector. Now, in terms of the question that then next comes in, when you look at that amount and the fact that the expectation of disruption should have a big delta, we may not be able to see a big delta. And that's probably what then leads us to the discussion about what is it that is slowing down the impact. What is it that is affecting the impact and not making it be as great as one would ordinarily expect? The authors attributed this mainly to do with the regulatory restrictions within the economy, which then kind of restrict the actual growth within the economy, and then you don't derive the benefits that you'll expect to have as a result of that. So there's a discussion on the financial sector, but again, as we said, it is heavily skewed. So a discussion of the Ethiopian financial sector is basically a discussion of the Ethiopian banking industry. And even within the banking industry, the author has a graph there, which shows is again concentrated 60 to 70% is within the public sector. And in terms of decisioning, you'll find again the decisions might not be as swift as the stakeholders would expect. There's this anxiety that with the opening up of this economy, we are likely to see a lot more liberalization and a lot more prompt to change. So that will be able to tell with time. I liked the detail in the paper. However, it comes at a little price because the detail at some stage I felt probably was a bit onerous in some areas. But if we were to focus back within the Ethiopian financial financial banking sector, because we agreed financial sector and banking sector are more or less the same within Ethiopia, there's a discussion as to whether the digital penetration that is led by ATM and POS necessarily has a trend that can be related to mobile banking users. Within Ethiopia, the author states, and I hope I understood it correctly, it's led by ATMs and POS, and then followed by mobile banking users. But that's the interesting part about disruptive technology, because it does not need to follow a predictable path. The next question that will come in, is it possible that this path in the future could actually be inverted? Why I'm asking this is that there are what you call the antecedents that caused this path to be there. If you look at the other markets, when we were having ATMs and POS, probably the mobile banking technology was not as advanced. But right now it's very advanced. Whoever the new players that are in the market will possibly come in with the advanced technology. They'll not come with the old technology. They'll come in with the advanced technology. So could there be a possibility that this trend does not need to follow that pattern? Now, when I look at the paper, we spent a lot of time discussing the supply side. But then the other issues, and as was stated in the earlier paper, one of the earlier papers, the other demand-related issues that can actually affect the growth of uptake of digital technology. What are these demand-side discussions? What are these demand-side issues that we probably need to be cognizant of that could then affect the growth of digital technology. Internet is driven by education and income affordability. We could spend more time and explore that relationship and ask ourselves what exactly, and we could link into the earlier paper, what exactly affects this, what exactly could be causing this growth. Comparatively, we've looked at the impact of digitalization on GDP. How do you compare this with the other countries that we've looked at, Kenya? Because you said we are slow compared to the rest of the other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. But when you look at the same measure compared to the other countries, how does it look like? How has this been influenced by the availability of the digital terrestrial infrastructure? Ethiopia is a very big country. So if you look at countries like Kenya, they are smaller comparatively, and they've probably been able to map out the entire country with their infrastructure. So what are the challenges? What is holding back? Is it an income discussion? Because as much as we could say it's a regulatory issue, it's a macroeconomic discussion as to laying out all that infrastructure. What is the taxation regime? How do tax rates affect ICT services and appliances? And ultimately, how do they affect the uptake of digital technology? The other point that I wanted to look at is the discussion about the evolution, what I'm calling the evolution of telecommunications. If you look at, say specifically, Kenya, for a long time it was voice driven. Now this plan is shifting towards broadband and data. Does Ethiopia need to necessarily follow this path because the penetration has been low? Do you still need to push a lot of voice and rather than just go straight into data and broadband investment? So those are some of the things, some of the thoughts which come into my mind in terms of what are some of the progressive things that we need to map out if we are to come out with recommendations. Understandably, we've had discussions with the specific case studies, the owners of the farm, and they laid out what they think holds them back. But I think ultimately, we still need to look at the demand side. What is it that the population will be interested in? Because they can only subscribe to what they can afford. So comparatively, if you are going to have expansive financial digitization, are the people in the rural and the more remote areas of Ethiopia able to afford that? I will stop at this stage and thank you very much. I really enjoyed going through the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Very, very good questions. Okay, so we may ask some people who want to intervene.
Chair, there are two questions
Can you read them out, please?
from the online participants. From someone with the name Jesus. I think this question was asked early, but it's relevant to this session. He says, hello, my question is that inclusion in Sub-Saharan Africa and what should be done concretely. I've just translated, this was asked in French. Then Abi Kadir asked Tualemai, what is mobile? Oh, there was a spelling issues there. It's called, what is mobile transaction? It was a transition. They say, if yes, it looks to have a dramatic growth in the last couple of years and is worth investigating further. That's just a comment from Abi Kadir. Thank you. There's a rejoinder, there's a hand from Ms. Gable.
Let's go. Sorry.
Thank you, both. I would like to thank both Professor Alamayo and also the discussant, because they have really, that is a good job in my view, and it's very important analysis and also which can inform a policy, I think, in this regard. But what I would like to get clearance. I mean, explanation is also regarding this. The analysis is all particularly focused on measuring, or identifying effects of disruptive technologies in Ethiopian financial sector. But what I didn't get clear is the issue of ownership, particularly in this analysis, particularly, the public sector dominance in the banking sector, what matters for, or what explains, as a cause, or for the digitalization process not taking place. That's my take. Of course, the fact, we have to also present the fact in this analysis, because we actually moved from completely public dominant, 100% public dominant, public dominant financial sector to somehow now around 40% is for private sector. So I think it is good to show that evolution, because now we are also now moved to a very, very big policy action, which you might have heard recently, that the government also decided to open, the banking sector even to the foreigner. So I think that it is good to acknowledge, those evolutions, because these policy actions are, of course, for quite some time it was stagnant, so now again the banking sector is also, the private sector are also taking that part, and so it's good to look into that. The other thing is also, maybe the discussant or also pointed out, when you consider the disruptive technologies, particularly the mobile banking, it is all by regulation. It's only that decided recently that to also use mobile banking in the financial sector. It's only recently, and we have seen a very big jump. So really, that timing may not be, in my view, a very short period of time. So maybe going forward, this is a very, I can say in the analysis, maybe this is too short to conclude anything. Maybe that's also my observation that I have seen. Otherwise, if you give us also the policy implications for, from your analysis, particularly the policy implication is very important. So it should be, of course, in the paper we can find it, but the policy implications is also very important to see that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So many hands. So let's take them. Huh? I mean, it's okay. So the lady.
Thank you, and for a really excellent presentation. It has constantly been said that, and because you used Kenya for comparison purposes, that the mobile wallets have contributed to the expansion, if I can use that term, or entrenchment of financial inclusion in Kenya. And so with the findings that you've presented to us, how do you think that could compare with Ethiopia, with the lower levels of mobile payments, transactions, mobile wallets, probably overall? Would you be able to compare that with the levels of financial inclusion in the country? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Mine is a quick methodological question. You showed Solo's growth equation, which you modified by including digitalization as a factor of production, which is very original. I mean, this is a 1957 theory and has changed fundamentally. But my question for you then, but you proxy digitalization as sort of mobile connections. So that sounds to me, if I got you correctly, as being associated with growth. But that seems to me like an infrastructural issue, a public level of technology that enables users to access digital services. But if you endogenize the digital technology or digitalization itself, meaning what do the banks themselves invest in terms of their own competences, would that have an even more significant association or effect on growth? So I don't know if you thought why you stuck with the exogenous growth rather than endogenous growth. Do you have a reason for that? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question that is very close to the question that has just been raised, and mine is more of a theoretical question than methodological. But it's based on the inclusion of digitalization as part of the solo model, because the paper computes the total factor productivity in the context of the solo residual, which is rooted in the exogenous growth theory. Now, in this context, we know that technological progress is responsible for long-term growth in the exogenous growth theory. And so we don't expect to see technological progress captured as part of the endogenous factors informing growth. And so that leaves me the option to interpret the inclusion of digitalization as in the context of endogenous growth theory. But then I have a problem with that, because my thinking is that in the context of Ethiopia and most of Africa, technology is adopted after it has been developed elsewhere. And that raises the question of whether it is part of our endogenous factors of production. The fact that it is adopted having been developed elsewhere, can it be grouped under endogenous factors? And if it can, then what is the rationale for including it as part of the endogenous growth theory? So I was going to suggest that perhaps it would be interesting to have a secondary relationship, because I've seen in the paper that you have also tested this model with economic value added at the sectoral level. So have that as a secondary relationship, and then extract the component explained by digitalization in the value addition, and then use that as a factor, if possible. That is just a thought. Use that as a factor in the growth model, rather than using it directly, because I find it questionable to have it used directly as an endogenous factor in the growth model. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Prof.
Okay, thank you. Mine is a very brief clarification. In the when you are giving the comparison with Kenya, the example you gave us was just about based on Equity. I just wanted to know, did you just base your comparison using Equity Bank, or did you use other commercial banks? Thank you.
Yes, Jason. Sorry, Alec. You have to wait a bit.
So, sorry, I do apologize. I'll be relatively quick. Within most of these case studies and in most examples of industrial policy, banking policy, etc., there's a very vibrant political economy that involves multiple actors, each obviously with their own interests and their own ways of doing things and what they want to achieve out of a particular for example, like adopting a digital technology, disruptive digital technology, there's different actors who want different things from it. Now, you mentioned the, I want to say, fragmented Ethiopian banking sector dominated by one large bank, and obviously the lack of capacity and capabilities from a regulatory perspective. So I guess my question is, who is meant to drive the adoption of disruptive technologies? I mean, if you have all these banks coming together to form a banking association, and they're led by one large bank, obviously that bank is going to try and do its best to protect its own interests. So where does the starting block begin? Who kicks it off? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's give Alex a chance to say his bit. There are many interesting questions, Alex.
Yeah,
you don't need to answer all of them.
No, okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I think this most likely shows that people do have interest on the paper, that a lot of questions came. I'm very happy about it. Let me start from the theoretical thing. Excellent comments by my friend there and here on the theory, the use of the solo model. Actually, when I used that, what I did was I assumed, as he said, it was exogenous for us. We pretty much adopting it. So therefore, it should be, I assumed it should be part of the residual in the solo model. And in the sense that therefore, it is an exogenous. But pretty much what you guys have said is, if I make it endogenous, I was worried that we're not creating that technology, therefore we shouldn't take it as the endogenous. That's why I stick to that. Yet I left it open. I didn't restrict the parameters to obey, to add to what. I just make it open so that if there is some externalities, it will show me. That was. But I think his suggestion is also a good one. I could try what he suggested. Second, probably I would also try by having an interaction term with each of the labor and the capital in case if arguments labor and the capital. And this is excellent comment. I will take it. And the second one is the Ben gave me quite nice comments. And for instance, the clarification about digitalization from the outset, which you emphasized, the distinction between digitalization and disruptive. I would do that. It's an excellent comment. I just take it. Now, the interesting question about you picked, and also some other participants picked, is this looks like at early stage, and could the trend could be inverted? That's quite right. I think so, because like now Safaricom is moving to Ethiopia. They just started last week. Now, in my reading, some 4 or 5 years ago, 30% of Safaricom's income is coming from the financial side of the business, not from voice, not from the data. And 3 years ago, it was growing by 20% per annum in Kenya. And today, Safaricom's income, 50% is not from voice and data, but from the financial sector. Now, and the government allowed, I heard, now Safaricom to do a mobile business in Ethiopia. So if for me, that is like opening up the financial sector pretty much. And I think then you are right in that sense that this could be inverted. There will be a shift towards more mobile banking once Safaricom comes. And that's why even the national telecom company, which is a monopoly, is aggressively now working on mobile banking. And I think in just 1 year, it managed to get a subscription of more than 20 million people. So definitely the trend is towards that. Your good comment, the other one is the demand side. Of course, you are absolutely right. I focused only on the supply side. And probably if I get the time, because this one needs more household level data to get this demand side, the education, the literacy, the digital literacy, as I believe it has serious impact. The digital literacy, if you compare it in Kenya and Ethiopia, is incomparable. And definitely that will have an impact. In Ethiopia, like we had something probably 120 million people, 80% is in rural area, and 60-70% of them are illiterate. So definitely that matters a lot, and I will take that on board. But I don't think I will do that requires probably a separate demand side analysis. The same you picked about the infrastructure issue compared to Kenya, and that the impact on growth. I think that's very important. Taxation. I haven't checked that one. The taxation, the impact. I haven't checked this one, but I will check this one. Now, what Mazgaba picked an important issue that I think he picked two issues. One, probably the ownership matters because probably 20 years ago, we never had any private banks. In the last 20 years, this private banks has developed, and they now account for 40% of the banking sector indicators like loans, deposit, and what have you. So definitely it matters. But in this study, I also investigated the private sector bankers. And from that, what I learned was this, in particular, the central bank is a major bottleneck for their activities, the regulatory system. So I don't know, like with the coming of the Safaricom and the Ethio Telecom mobile money system, I would say both will proportionately increase, because still Ethio Telecom is publicly owned as it stands, and Safaricom is private. Therefore, I think the private public share will already Ethio Telecom has, as I said, 22 million subscribers is ahead of Safaricom. Therefore, they will probably increase proportionately. Who else? Abbi asked why the jump online. He asked why the jump in the recent period. The major reason, probably Mazgab already answered it, is that the law to use mobile banking is a recent phenomenon itself, and that could be the major factors for this one. Who else? I didn't quite get the last question you mentioned. The last one. Do they have an association that can counteract the public sector? Is that your
Yeah,
question?
I mean, I guess I'm looking at the interplay between the different players within the market. Right, you got the regulatory side of things. You got the guys that are the banks that are actually looking to, or not looking in many cases, to implement and adopt disruptive technologies. So I guess I'm asking is, who is meant to take the first step there? Is it supposed to come driven by the state through like a digital banking framework policy set, something like that? Or would you think that maybe the banks would kind of club together and through an association say, this is the way we're going to take the industry forward?
Okay, I got it. Now, they do have, the banks have banking association, the private bankers. Pretty much it's top down, pretty much. Regulator comes from the central bank, and then they have to adapt to that. And one of the recommendations, I presented this paper to some of the private bankers, and one of the recommendation I did was, you guys come collectively and then present your cases for the central bank and make sure that your interests are served that way. That pretty much I did. But as it stands, the central bank is very much bossy, and then some of them, they even afraid to talk to the guys there. They might have reprisal. Rosemary, I forgot what you asked me. Rosemary.
Yeah, I asked whether you used only equity or you.
No,
yeah,
exactly. I remember. No, I used also commercial bank. I didn't show you on this on the slide, but I used Commercial Bank of Kenya and Equity Bank, both of them. I know Equity is a bit unique. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we have had quite a run. Thanks, Alex. So let's give him and the discussant a round of applause. So maybe if you agree with me, our Kipra presentation, can we have it after people are awake, or you want it now? My sense is the ED also will be coming at 2:15, just to welcome and also say a bit of remarks himself. So we'll make it after the ED remarks. So we have 1 hour lunch break, nothing more. So we go out and we come back at 2. The lunch is right there. So I'm sorry, but we'll have maybe a longer coffee break. I promise that one. Okay. So thanks everyone. Those of you who attend virtually, also you may take 1 hour break. You are going to miss some nice lunch here, but still, we really appreciate your presence. Thank you so much.